I'm an analyst. I'm an analyst in the Safety Policy Division, and this is our workshop for the Safety Culture Assessment Rulemaking R.21-10-001. I'm going to get us started just with a quick overview of the meeting agenda, and then I'm going to pass it over to the commissioners for opening remarks. So the desired goals of this meeting are to work to build consensus on the goals and the guiding principles for conducting the safety culture assessment pursuant to this proceeding, to receive initial comments on the Safety Policy Division's proposed approach for integrating some of the feedback we've received to date into the staff proposal that we create for this proceeding, and then finally to communicate and discuss some next steps for the proceeding. So here's an overview of our agenda for today. So after we do our welcome and introduction and opening remarks, we're going to have two party presentations on the goals and guiding principles for the proceeding. Then we're going to do a Safety Policy Division presentation, have a facilitated question and answer discussion, and end with closing remarks. So we have 2 hours here today and quite a bit of information to get through. So we'll try to be as efficient as possible today. And then just a few quick virtual housekeeping notes. So as you heard, this meeting is being recorded, and we will distribute the meeting recorded. Funny timing. We'll distribute the recording for the workshop after the meeting, as well as the slides that we sent to the service list. All of these materials will also be on the Safety Policy Division website. And then if you have questions throughout the workshop, you can either type them into the chat or you can hold them for the end session that we talked about that will be at the end of the workshop. And we'll also try to do our best to stick to the starting time for all of the presentations, so that we can finish all of the material that we have prepared within the 2 hours. I think we all heard an echo a second ago, so just make sure that if you're not speaking, that you are muted. So if you are unfamiliar with WebEx, all of the controls for muting and unmuting and raising your hand or typing into the chat are at the bottom of your screen here. So next, I'm going to pass it over to Commissioner Houck first for opening remarks. And thank you, Commissioner Houck, for being here today.
So thank you, Emma, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for the workshop in this proceeding, R.21-10-001, which is the Commission Safety Culture Assessment Rulemaking. I want to thank Emma for facilitating today's workshop and for all of the work that she's done on the proceeding, along with Saeed Bagari and Administrative Law Judge Rizzo. They've done an excellent job in preparing for today's workshop and all of their work in the proceeding. And I also want to thank Carolina Contreras, Ben Turner, Forrest Kaiser, and Galen LeMay for their support in the proceeding. The Commission has conducted energy utility safety culture assessments in response to catastrophic events such as the PG&E San Bruno explosion and the SoCalGas Aliso Canyon event. Those are and remain very important actions by the Commission in the evaluation of investor-owned utility safety culture. This proceeding is intended to standardize safety culture reviews for each of the large energy utilities pursuant to AB 1004, the wildfire mitigation statute enacted in 2020. Under the statute, the Commission is required to examine an electrical corporation safety culture every 5 years. This provision in AB 1054 is accompanied by another provision requiring the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety or Energy Safety to examine safety culture every year. One purpose of this proceeding and the workshop today is to make sure that the different proceedings addressing safety culture are harmonious and don't work at cross purposes. And in regards to that, this OIR has added looking at natural gas safety culture related matters as well. So we're looking at both electrical in conjunction with the wildfire and natural gas. Another purpose of today's workshop is to develop a test for examining electric utilities safety culture that goes beyond ensuring utility worker safety, which is a critical component of any safety culture. The test developed here will, in addition to looking at worker safety, will also examine the extent to which the utility is protecting the public safety, an equally critical component of investor-owned utility safety culture. There are numerous proceedings and processes before the Commission and before Energy Safety that examine whether and how the utilities are hardening their electric grids, managing vegetation, and engaging in other practices that reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire, natural gas-related risks, and other serious safety risks. Safety culture looks at a utility's culture to determine whether safety is top of mind in everything the utility does. It requires the utility to go beyond a compliance mindset where the utility leadership and staff views the utility's obligation as mere compliance with regulations. A utility with a strong safety culture, of course, complies with such regulations, but it does much more than that. It ensures management, employees, and contractors are not afraid to report safety risks and stop working when such risks appear. It puts public health and public safety above profit. Today, we'll hear from the Commission staff about comments to date on a concept paper that had been released that was designed to measure and enhance development of a robust utility safety culture. We'll hear an outline of staff's comments and a summary of party comments on the proposals. We'll hear from the investor-owned utilities, and we'll discuss the areas of greatest disagreement among the parties and between the parties as to the staff concepts and proposals. This workshop provides the utilities, other parties, staff, and commissioners that are present here today an opportunity to hear different perspectives, which will inform the staff safety culture proposal that is anticipated to be issued at the end of the year. There will be an opportunity for parties and the public to provide comment prior to consideration by the Commission in early 2023. I also want to acknowledge and welcome the experts that are joining us today that have been working with us throughout the technical workshops over the summer. And I really look forward to the discussion this morning, and we'll turn it back over to Emma for opening comments from any of my other colleagues that are joining us today.
Thank you, Commissioner Howe, for those opening comments. Next, I wanted to ask Commissioner John Reynolds if you have any opening remarks that you'd like to give.
Thank you so much. I will just briefly say I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you so much to Commissioner Howe for your leadership in this area. Thank you to the staff for hosting this workshop. I look forward to learning more about how we can continue to improve safety culture assessments and use them to encourage utilities to deliver excellence operations, which is what Californians expect and deserve from their utilities. Thanks again, and I will look forward to this workshop.
Thank you, Commissioner Reynolds. Next, I'm going to pass it over to Commissioner Rechtschaffen if you have any opening remarks you'd like to give.
Well, I just very briefly, since Commissioner Howe really laid out the issues very well, as she notes, there's a lot going on, and the work we do on safety and safety culture touches many proceedings, and there's some overlap, but that's okay, because there's really nothing more critical that we do in this area. We have a lot of regulations that promote compliance, but that only gets us so far. And safety culture asks the utilities to continue to engage in ongoing safety improvements to reach the highest forms of safety promotion. And it's something we need to continue to work on all the time. Not to say that the record of the utilities justifies anything less, but even companies and entities that have good safety records are constantly trying to improve them through safety culture efforts. I'm hoping today that we can hear highlighted the different frameworks and get some understanding of how to move forward in the future, some guidance for staff, and how we can maximize participation from everybody, contractors, employees, management, board of directors, everyone who touches on the need for safety improvement. So I'm looking forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Etchoff. And lastly, I wanted to pass it over to Commissioner Shiroma for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Commissioner Hauk, for your leadership on this very important effort. Essentially, I'm here to listen and to learn. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Shiroma, and thank you all commissioners for being here to listen in on this workshop. Next, I'm going to go over just a quick proceeding background. So we wanted to provide a background of our timeline to date for the proceeding in case any of you haven't been present for the technical working group meetings that we hosted throughout the summer. So over the summer, we hosted a series of 4 technical working group meetings. After the first 2 technical working group meetings, we issued an ALJ ruling and a staff concept paper. And then we did the same thing after the 3rd and the 4th technical working group meeting. So what we learned from those, from the feedback solicited after the concept papers, is something that we're hoping to discuss today in this workshop. So I'm going to provide a quick summary of those two rulings. So after the first ALJ ruling, we received feedback from parties that there is value in the commission setting a framework for the IOUs to conduct safety culture assessment. So there's value in like a unified framework that all the large utilities would use to conduct assessments. We also heard that utilities would prefer that we use the INPO, which is the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations Safety Culture Framework, as opposed to the PURE framework, which was developed by an outside consultant for the commission to conduct assessments. We learned that it would be really valuable if the commission helped facilitate the sharing of best practices and lessons learned, potentially with the help of an outside third-party facilitator with the utilities. So sharing best practices between the utilities and between the utilities and the CPUC. We learned that it could be valuable to have a voluntary self-reporting initiative, which we've seen in other industries, such as the airline industry, to allow for non-punitive reporting of incidents that would help us garner lessons learned from those incidents. We learned that utilities would prefer not to include safety culture in inspections and audits for fear that this might hinder the trust that the utilities would have between the utilities and the regulator, or that it might lead to penalties for these safety culture observations. We heard some opposing views on whether or not contractors should be included in the definition of safety culture. And then finally, we heard from parties that the commission should reflect on its own safety culture and think about how to strengthen it, as we discussed in some of the workshops. In September, we released the second ruling and second concept paper, resulting from the last two technical working group meetings that we hosted over the summer. And this is some of the feedback that we received from the September ALJ ruling and concept paper. So we heard from parties that it would be helpful to pause to revisit our goals and guiding principles for the proceeding. That's something that we're hoping to do in the first two presentations for this working group meeting. Commissioner Reshoffman, do you have your hand raised, or is that?
No, I'm just trying to, I apologize, Emma. I'm just trying to see the screen since it's too small for my eyes. But I've just magnified it, so I'm okay. No, I apologize.
No worries. I just want to make sure. We also heard some differing opinions on whether or not safety culture assessment should align with the RAMP and general rate case proceedings. So that's our risk-making proceedings that the other half of the Safety Policy Division helps lead. We heard from parties that it may be beneficial to delay the initial safety culture assessment until after 2023, so we have more time to have a solid foundation for the assessments before kicking things off. Parties said that we should be sure to sync the requirements that the commission does with the existing requirements that energy safety has for annual safety culture assessments of electric utilities. Parties also commented that they felt that the pure model was incompatible with their internal maturity models that they use or safety culture frameworks that they use for conducting assessments internally. To track progress on safety culture, parties recommended using leading outcomes and indicators, including the existing safety performance metrics that are used to report safety performance to the commission on an annual basis as is. Parties agreed that it would be more helpful to compare results over time within a utility than across utilities. So the goal of the assessment should really be to see how an individual utility is improving its own safety culture, not to compare different utilities because the operations of those utilities are so different. And then finally, there were sort of differing opinions on whether or not it would be helpful to have the same third party conduct all of the safety culture assessments. And that was a topic that parties suggested that we did spend more time discussing and digging into. So that's sort of a broad overview of the feedback that we've received to date. And as I said, we're gonna really focus on this first bullet on this slide of talking about the goals and the guiding principles for the proceeding in our next section of the workshop. So to get us started with that, I think that Jason, you're gonna kick us off with this presentation, right?
That's right. Thank you, Emma.
All right, so I can go ahead and hand it over to you and control your slides.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And I'll start by giving very quick introductions for the joint presenters. It's Elizabeth Peters with SDG&E, Melvin Brown with Edison, Tom Kahino with PG&E, and myself, Jason Egan, with SoCalGas. We want to first thank the Commission and Commission staff for the significant work that's gone into this rulemaking. The materials, the external speakers, the several technical working group sessions have all been very valuable opportunities and how we can best advance our question. Preparing for this workshop presented us an additional opportunity. We took time to review prior workshop materials, reviewed the concept papers, the guiding principles.
Jason, your audio is faded out.
My audio is off. Better?
It's just a little faint. So I think just make sure that you're close to the microphone.
Okay, let me see if I can rearrange where my computer is. Sorry about that. Is that any better? I'll try to stay loud as well. Thank you. So as I was saying, preparing for the workshop presented us another opportunity to collaborate. We looked at prior workshop materials. We reviewed the concept papers, the guiding principles. We also discussed some of our own past experiences where we had alignment in our thoughts on pathways forward. Through these efforts, we crafted today's presentation to share our thoughts on goals and principles for future safety culture assessments. We can go to the next slide. So we wanted to start by saying in our presentation, we did not just comment on the proposed guiding principles, but rather we worked together to develop our own proposed goal and then coalesce around several core principles. We are very appreciative of the significant work that went into crafting the proposed guiding principles. And throughout our presentation, we have looked to note alignment with both the guiding principles and also other discussions and materials that were shared throughout the proceeding. Presentations from experts, presentations from Safety Policy Division, or other items that we're flagging. To start, the proposed goal that we developed.
Sorry about this, but Jason, you just faded away.
I fade again?
Yeah, it's hard to hear you.
Let me see if I can adjust something. I apologize. see if this helps at all. Is that an improvement? Okay. It is. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. The proposed goal we put together is that the assessments be used to influence and support the development and maintenance of healthy safety cultures through non-punitive engagement, collaboration, learning, and continuous improvement. We then used that goal to develop core principles, and from there we think the goal and principles could be used to guide the development and adoption of an assessment process that is consistent with the principles and advances us towards our goal. Again, intentionally, we crafted our goal to be consistent with what we thought was an important basic assumption identified by Safety Policy Division in one of the earlier workshops, and that is that learning, proactive engagement, and continuous improvement are essential elements of improving safety cultures. As will be detailed by my colleagues in the slides that follow, we then developed several core principles that were, again, consistent with materials discussion had in this proceeding. That's the importance of focusing on influencing and the value of non-punitive engagement and collaboration, the need to foster.
You're fading in and out again, Jason. We're having trouble hearing you.
I am not sure that it's a hardware issue on my end. If it fades back in, I'm near the end. So is this better now? Okay. The need to foster a learning and continuous improvement orientation, and then recognition that this is a significant and new undertaking in science, and that it is appropriate to take steps to identify, understand, and prevent potential unintended consequences, and relatedly recognize limitations to the assessment process. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Apologies for the technical difficulties, and thank you again.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Peters, SDG&E Safety Management System Manager. So fingers crossed that you can all hear me, but I'll keep my eyes open. So Emma, just flag me down if it starts to fade out, please. As Jason mentioned, SDG&E, SoCalGas, PG&E, and Edison have all worked together to identify meaningful core principles to realize our common goal of continuously improving the safety culture of each of our respective organizations. So Emma, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. So we've identified 4 core principles, 2 of which I'm going to speak to on behalf of the joint utilities. These 2 principles are inextricably linked. And so the first core principle is commission focus on influence and support in the development and maintenance of healthy safety cultures through the assessment framework. The joint utilities recommend that the commission can best influence a healthy safety culture by focusing on collaboration, engagement, learning, and forward-looking improvement, as Jason mentioned, not punishment or enforcement. These principles that each of our utilities apply within our own respective organizations to advance our own safety cultures. And it applies a continuous improvement framework which allows for greater trust by providing a process for open and transparent communications without fear of punishment. In prior technical working group meetings, Safety Policy Division has recognized the challenges around influencing versus mandating safety culture, with a focus on influencing as a preferred pathway. Again, this applies a core principle that each of the IOUs apply to our own respective organizations as we strive to move from a compliance-driven to value-driven organizations. Dr. Schulman provided a very well-said quote during our second technical working group meeting, noting that it is important to find the appropriate strategies to motivate companies to engage in self-development processes for safety culture and to help them along the way without giving direct instructions. Dr. Schulman's statement recognizes that each of our utilities have unique safety cultures that have been developed based on our individual history, experience, location, size, and workforce. It also recognizes the notion that utilities are each responsible for their own safety culture. Taking into account our uniquenesses, successes, and challenges, we can all improve our respective safety cultures with appropriate influence and support, and in doing so, advanced our stated proposed goal for the Commission to influence and support the development and maintenance of healthy safety cultures through non-punitive engagement, collaboration, learning, and continuous improvement. To focus on influence and support, the joint utilities assert that safety culture assessment should be forward-looking to identify opportunities for improvement and again explicitly be non-punitive. Safety culture assessment should not become enforcement mechanisms, but instead help facilitate growth through learning. In order for each of our utilities to advance our own respective safety cultures, we must encourage our own employees and contractors to speak up, share, listen, and learn in a non-punitive manner. Simply put, we're looking to apply those same concepts here. Emma, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The second core principle I'd like to address is engagement and collaboration being essential to the Commission's safety culture assessment process. Each IOU recognizes the importance of a strong safety culture, have each work to advance our own respective safety cultures, and are at varying levels of maturity. The development, implementation, evaluation, and refinement of the Commission's safety culture assessment process and framework could be advanced through engagement and collaboration between the Commission and the utilities to recognize each of the utilities' efforts to date and acknowledge that each ultimately own their own safety culture. We can all learn from one another and identify opportunities for continuous improvement if we have a framework that fosters collaboration, trust, transparency, and learning. As noted by the Commission's safety culture experts in prior workshops, unilateral regulation inhibits the development of a strong safety culture. Prior workshops also similarly highlighted the importance of engagement and collaboration to learn from the experiences of other regulators and organizations. Just as the utilities can learn from one another, the Commission can also learn from other regulatory agencies. For example, the Canada Energy Regulator highlights the following principles as being key to their success: positively influencing safety outcomes through outreach, education, and collaboration, collaborating with industry associations and other regulators to share and implement best practices, and developing effective partnerships based on relationship building and trust focused on collective safety culture learning. These are all embedded within the core principles the joint utilities propose here today. We believe that prioritizing collaboration and engagement in this process, while all working towards a common goal, will result in greater success in achieving that goal. So again, thank you to the commissioners for this opportunity. And next I'm going to turn it over to PG&E to discuss the next core principle proposed by the joint utilities.
If we can advance the slide. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Emma. The third core principle is to foster learning and continuous improvement. I'm not going to read the second and third major bullets because there already is great alignment between the initial set of guiding principles and ours. But on the top one, in some ways, foster learning and continuous improvement is the most important one because as we've shared already, and as we know, we can't dictate performance at any level, whether that's at the commission or in the supervisor level. But all we can do is continue to learn and improve, and that's the focus that we want to have today. First, thank you for asking us to review and present on the 4 safety culture frameworks, because that led us to realize 2 things. First, an appreciation for the work that went into the pure proposal. Unquestionably a great deal of work, thoughtful work, and we appreciate that. The second thing it helped us realize was that, however, we unanimously agree on the overwhelming benefits of the IMPO framework. And the reasons for that include strong institutional support, decades of use in the riskiest part of the utility infrastructure, extensive and existing guidance materials can be easily adapted. The framework easily and understandably complements the deployment of our respective safety management systems. It's known and in use, and in PG&E's case, of course, by Diablo Canyon, and there's a great deal of utility assets in PG&E. So there's great alignment, and we're seeking to increase that alignment between Diablo Canyon and the rest of the non-nuclear utility. We believe we can learn a great deal, and Edison, SDG&E have some IMPO familiarity from the legacy of songs. And most recently, SoCalGas went through a safety culture assessment that was based on the 10 traits. So there is familiarity across all utilities, and that points to one of the benefits. We believe that learning and improvement will be accelerated with the IMPO framework, and we don't want to go back or slow down. And we jumped ahead in some of the deck, and so we're excited about what we've seen so far. So thank you for allowing us to participate in this conversation and decisions to be reached. With that, I'll turn it over to Melvin.
Thank you, Tom. And Emma, could we please go to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm Melvin Brown. I lead the safety strategy and culture transformation team here at SCE. As stated by a panel of experts during our first technical working group, we really don't know a standard recipe for growing a safety culture within an organization. Safety culture is complex. It's still very much an emergent science, and as such, we think it's important to be mindful in taking steps to prevent unintended consequences, as well as recognizing the limitations and approaches to regulating safety culture. We recognize and appreciate that the Safety Policy Division's guiding principles implicitly acknowledge limitations and the need for a balanced approach. For example, focusing on coordinating but not necessarily duplicating existing safety and reporting requirements, ensuring that we're having meaningful information sharing across regulated utilities, where we're proposing focusing less so on the comparison across utilities and more so on how we foster learning, how we foster sharing and continuous improvement as well. As mentioned before, throughout this process, the IOUs have been partnering very closely together, and we absolutely see the value in continued collaboration and sharing, and we're committed to developing a framework that supports this. From an unintended consequence perspective, we are specifically concerned about the potential for the following. Assessment results being used in a punitive fashion, as mentioned earlier. This inherently reduces trust, it hinders learning and it hinders growth. As employees may become more reluctant to volunteer information where there's fear of repercussions. We've seen examples where this has worked well in the aviation industry, as well as in this proceeding through the Canada Energy Regulator. Candid feedback on perceptions of safety culture, as well as reporting actual and potential incidents, are crucial to providing an accurate assessment of current state, as well as opportunities to holistically address root causes. Another potential unintended consequence occurs when assessment activities are duplicative. This can lead to employee survey fatigue, something we're currently dealing with today, particularly for field organizations, which can ultimately contribute to diminishing data quality as employees complete what they feel are similar surveys. Their engagement and quality of responses can decline over time. This ultimately impacts the fidelity of reactions and interventions that's in part based on this data. And lastly, potentially having an assessment framework that does not inform a holistic approach to safety culture, leading to efforts with limited impact on strengthening safety culture and improving safety performance. The joint utilities also suggest recognition of the following relative to what's already been highlighted by Safety Policy Division. Specifically, each organization's safety culture and safety culture maturity is unique. Safety culture assessments are not quantitatively comparable across IOUs, but they are useful tools to influence and promote learning, proactive engagement, and continuous improvement through information sharing across our regulated utilities. And lastly, utilities have a limited ability to control the culture of external stakeholders. Utilities agree with the Commission that we must be the owners of our safety culture. This foundational principle must also be applied to the organizations with whom we contract. Therefore, it's our view that the utility should not be held directly responsible for the safety culture of our contractors or other third-party entities. We do have acting on our responsibility to ensure that we are influencing a strong safety culture through our contractual agreements. For example, at SCE, we look at the entirety of the life cycle of our contractors. We ensure that we're setting and enforcing the expectations that holds our contractors accountable for developing and sustaining the safety culture that we know will lead to improved safety performance. Can we move to the next slide, please, Emma? Thank you. To close, the joint utilities are grateful to the Commission for inviting our perspectives on what our shared goals and guiding principles should be. We see a path to success through the Commission's partnership to influence and support the development and maintenance of a healthy safety culture through non-punitive engagement, collaboration, learning, and continuous improvement. And we see alignment between the Commission's guiding principles and our proposed core principles, as long as there's focus on non-punitive engagement, collaboration, learning, and continuous improvement. To close, with the combination of the Commission's focus on influencing and supporting safety culture, utility engagement and collaboration in developing an assessment framework, implementing that framework, evaluating and refining it, a continued commitment to learning and continuous improvement, and measures put in place to prevent potential unintended consequences, and the recognition of limitations when regulating safety culture, we do believe that we can create a successful framework to improve safety culture across the joint utilities and ultimately safety performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Melvin, and thank you all for your presentation. We have about 10 minutes where we can take questions on the joint utility presentation. So I first wanted to see if any of the commissioners had any questions on what was just presented. Commissioner Retschhoffen?
Well, I have two kinds of questions. One, in terms of the interplay with enforcement and compliance and punitive measures, how far do you go? What if the utility's own self-assessment uncovers evidence of a very serious violation or a crime or something like that? Or do you suggest that there be no regulatory consequence beyond whatever self-correction would happen through the safety culture process? And likewise, should the level of deference to the safety culture process vary based on how strong the safety culture process is? More forbearance by the Commission, for example, in terms of enforcement, the stronger the safety culture process is. So that's the first question. Then other commissioners may have other questions, so I'll pause before I ask something else. But I just wanted to know how do we think about that interplay?
And to clarify, is that question for the staff or is that for the?
It's for the utilities. The utilities,
okay,
since they made such a strong emphasis on collaboration, non-enforcement, trust, so forth.
Yeah, so any of the utilities, you can go ahead and come off mute and answer if you'd like.
Jason, did you want to respond? No.
This is Cedric, Chief Safety Officer at SoCalGas. I have a high-level response, Commissioner Retschhoffen, to your question, and then I'll let others that are a little closer to it chime in. But the way I would answer the first part of your question is that it doesn't take away what is already a mechanism to address violations that the Commission already has in its enforcement mechanism, right? So maybe I didn't understand your question correctly, but if there are violations found through any means, and there is an enforcement mechanism to address those. So I just want to make sure I understood the question.
I take it from part of what you're saying is you want us to trust in the system that you set up and you want it to be non-confrontational, non-adversarial. So to the extent there's a report of a problem that you uncover or that there's the diagnosis of a problem, you don't want it to result in us taking in a regulatory action because you're afraid that may deter people coming forward, or ways that you could remedy it in a way that doesn't deter future self-correction or self-diagnosis. I'm just trying to figure out the interplay with where the safety culture stops and where our enforcement comes in, because certainly if you're auditing on your own, or if you're doing evaluations, you may find some serious violation that you might otherwise report to us, or you might otherwise expect that we take an enforcement action. And I'm hearing some tension between that and allowing these the self-diagnosis, near miss reporting, other corrective actions that the company, one of the utilities could take on its own, as opposed to responding in a more traditional way. So I'm just trying to get a sense of where we draw lines and what's on one side versus another, because we certainly want to promote voluntary compliance and the utilities going beyond compliance and exceeding safety standards and not worry that everything is going to be checked to, result in us slapping your hand. But on the other hand, we want to guard against, we want to have the ability to respond appropriately if there's a serious infraction.
Yeah, so Cliff, sounds like you're kind of getting to the accountability question. And again, if there's anything that's inconsistent with the GO or the CFR, then obviously there's mechanisms in place to, whether it's self-reporting or things that are observed and found, to address those through the commission's enforcement mechanism. But I think what you're hearing from the IOUs, and I won't speak for everyone, but is really a concern around, putting this process in place, which is intended to encourage continuous improvement of safety culture through things that are beyond compliance, and then creating a punitive model and creating an awareness around not creating a punitive model for things that are culturally based or things that are less empirical than the violation of a rule or a policy or procedure. And really, when you're thinking about how you evolve culture and the things that you would put in place to do that, we're trying to draw a line between not moving as far or as fast as someone might think that you should, in terms of changing the way people think or process safety from different lenses, because that's harder to put a hard line around. The things that are concrete and specific, that are contained in our policies, contained in procedures, those things are straightforward. But the things that are required by any company to advance its culture, as you identify those things and you embark on efforts to improve those things, creating a punitive approach around that is, I think, what you're hearing the concern around.
Okay, I know Commissioner Shiroma has her hand up. So when you say in the slide before, we can best influence a healthy safety culture through means other than punishment or enforcement, what you're saying is we should give you more in terms of evaluating the safety culture program as distinct from specific violations or rules or infractions. When we're evaluating the program as a whole, we should not have an enforcement mindset. That's what that bullet is trying to get at?
Yes. And others, please chime in if I'm not capturing the position of all the other regulated utilities.
Hey, Cedric, this is Kevin Garrity at SDG&E. I agree with exactly what you put together. I think the intent of this is we're all trying to measure the presence of or absence of safety culture, which this may be the first time it's really done at this level. It's that specific measurement and exploration and improvements and all the things the utilities may undertake to improve safety culture. We would not want to be punitive, right? That's more of an environment set for coaching and mentoring and encouraging. But for all the other systems of safety that govern our wires, our pipes, health and safety of our facilities, the communities, employees, all those things would still live by what all the enforcement is available today.
Thank you.
Commissioner Houck, I think I saw your hand go up next.
Thank you, Emma. And just to follow on Commissioner Rechtschaffen's question, and I appreciate the utilities drawing that distinction between examining safety culture versus violating a specific rule or regulation. And, one of the difficulties I think here is that the language in the slides regarding collaboration and forward-looking, influencing safety culture, as opposed to mandating, building relationships, and creating support as opposed to fear and punishment, growth through learning as opposed to punitive. And I think some of the information, I think on slide 16 that Elizabeth presented, the positive influence for safety outcomes through outreach, education, and collaboration. All of those things I think are what we're striving for in regards to safety culture, so that we can build that collaborative space to be able to make sure that the regulator and the regulated are working together to have the same understanding of what safety culture is supposed to be, and overall promoting safety and preventing any kind of catastrophic event or safety violations is the ultimate outcome. I think creating that space and how we draw those lines between that collaborative mechanism and outreach and when we get into enforcement is where some of the difficulty happens in regards to how do we create that space to make sure that we can have those open dialogues and be honest, especially if there is something happening that may lead to some kind of an enforcement action. And I think those are some of the things we're grappling with here in this proceeding, is looking at how do we make sure that we're all working towards that ultimate goal that we all have, which is improving safety and making sure the public is safe, that your workers are safe, and customers are safe. And creating that space may not be easy. So to the extent we can look at opportunities to do that, and any specific thoughts you have on how we're able to create a space that is more forward-looking and collaborative to address safety culture components and build in that direction, while still knowing that we have to do our enforcement mechanism side if there is a violation of a rule or an order, and just looking at where that balance and those lines are, and being able to build those relationships, and hopefully it will lead to less enforcement. And I think that's what we all want. But any thoughts that you have on how we get to that space to sort of separate what is safety culture assessments and being able to have those honest, frank discussions between our staff and yours, and ensuring that we're all meeting our responsibilities.
This is Jason Egan. See if this noise is coming in a little bit better this time, hopefully. Excellent. I think these technical working sessions have been a good step in that direction. It's great to see that some of the feedback from the utilities has been received by staff, and there's been some thought about how it could be reflected in the assessment framework going forward. So I think that partnership is a good step in the right direction towards being more collaborative in how we put these frameworks together. And I think additionally, going forward, to continue to work through what the ultimate goals and principles are matters. I think what we document, what we put in writing in terms of what the commission, our shared goals are with these assessments, what the guiding principles are, and what the process is, will help document expectations, document understandings, and hopefully put into writing, put into words our shared expectations around collaboration, engagement, and influence.
Yeah, I would just add, kind of in response to Commissioner Houck's question, the framework where every utility that's under the purview of this rulemaking is at a starting point, right? Whatever that starting point is, and creating this kind of multi-year cycle where, using the IMPO example, in those 10 elements, to be able to kind of assess where you are and monitor progress against those elements, I think is the opportunity, at least from the commission standpoint, to be able to monitor and influence the growth of all the IOUs relative to where they are, right? And monitor and measure that progress moving forward. And it can be definitely collaborative, right? And so as we get evaluated, and a few years later we kind of get reassessed with current information and current perceptions, current attitudes, and we can see and track and monitor our growth. And if there is anywhere where we're seeing some challenges or move in the wrong direction, then obviously we would, the onus would be on the utility to indicate how they're thinking about making improvements in that area. But I think this framework could be the way that on this cycle of whether it's 3-5 years, whatever the right cycle is, to be able to see actual improvement take place based on the plans put in place by the IOUs.
I do also think, Mr. Melvin, with SCE, that there is somewhat of a blueprint that the panel of experts that the commission brought on earlier on in this process shared with us, right? So thinking back to what Chris Hart, Dr. Claudine Bradley shared their roadmap for, hey, this is a very complex issue, right? And so, I do think that as we continue to build this framework, it may be helpful to fold in the expertise of those who have gone before, build on those principles, apply them, test them, quite frankly, to see the extent to which they relate in our context. But I do think there's a wealth of knowledge that we can leverage to further flesh out what this actually looks like.
I think it's an interesting journey we're all on. In order for culture to be successful, people do have to report defects. They have to, right? And so if you put this in place and there's never a report that there's a defect, an error, a mistake, then it's not effective. And really the challenge is making sure that as we examine errors, defects, whatever in our safety systems, that we recognize that there are intentional acts and then there's just errors. And I really think that's the subtlety with this. You have to have a culture that makes it safe enough to report everything that is a mistake and an error, with the expectation that you as an individual will not be punished for it. But as an organization, you absolutely then will learn and change as a result of that being reported. But the main outcome of this has got to be an environment where we are seeing our colleagues and the public being able to raise issues and concerns.
I just wanted to add one last thing, Commissioner Hook. I really
sorry, Elizabeth. I don't mean to cut you off, but we're just a few minutes over, and I want to make sure that we get to Commissioner Shiroma's question really quickly. So maybe we could just spend a couple minutes on that really quickly, and then we can save the rest of our question and answer for the end of the workshop.
Can you give her like 30 seconds? I just do want to hear what and then we can still have Commissioner Shiroma's question. I want to make sure Commissioner Shiroma has her question, but I think we're here to hear what folks have to say. So I really would like to hear. Thank you.
I appreciate that, and we'll make it very short. Just to add that the electric corporations are subject to the annual wildfire safety culture assessments, and to your point on accountability and making sure we are implementing any findings stemming from safety culture assessments, utilities do currently file quarterly notification letters that talk about our progress, what we're implementing. So that could be a mechanism that could carry over here as well. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Commissioner Shiroma, if you wanted to ask your question.
And it's not a question, it's more an observation. If anybody wants to react to it, that's fine. On slide 18, there's a bullet which says, as other safety culture experts have stated previously, safety culture science is still immature and evolving. And that just kind of caught my eye because I thought, well, over 20 years ago when I was first elected to the SMUD board, we were embarking upon the decommissioning of the 900 megawatt nuclear power plant out at Rancho Seco. And that was a massive effort. And at that time, there were still spent fuel rods in water. And there was a extensive effort towards safety and understanding what it's like to work around a highly radioactive material. So I just thought I will want to learn more about why there's a view by some safety culture experts that is still immature and evolving. And maybe it has to do with the creation of metrics in around culture, but I don't know, we've been dealing with heavy industrial and even office settings for many, many decades. But again, I'll just make that as an observation on my part. No need to answer any kind of question. Thank you. I mean, unless somebody wants to say something, but there's no need to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shiroma. If the utilities don't have anything to respond to for Commissioner Shiroma's statement, then we can move on to the public advocate's presentation, but I'll pause here to make sure that's the case. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen now and I'll pass it over to you, Nina, if you'd like to share your screen for your presentation.
Thanks, Emma. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. First, I'd like to thank you and appreciate the opportunity to present on the guiding principles. I'm Mina Botros. I'm for Cal Advocates. I'm senior utilities engineer. And today we're presenting on the draft guidelines that came into the staff proposal as attachment to in Judge Rizu ruling in September 17, 2022. Due to time, we will pick the top 3 goals that we're looking forward to see in the final staff proposal. And those are the promote participation of all contractors, continuous learning, and commitment to continuous safety improvement. First point is related to the guiding principle, promote participation for the all IOU employees, IOU contractors, and key stakeholders, such as local and tribal governments. We want to stress that contractors play a significant role on the safety performance of the organization, and depending on the utility, some contractors may perform the majority of the critical work, like vegetation management and pipeline construction. So in fact, IOUs do have much control over their contractors because they set the contractor requirements in order to bid for work. So by doing that over time, they can require their contractors to be trained, equipped, and supervised similar to the IOU direct employees. The second point is related to the guiding principle, reflecting commitment to continuous safety improvement and learning based on practical experience and research evidence. And I want to clarify something. When we are talking about safety culture assessment here, we are talking about the holistic one, not the safety culture for wildfires, because those are related only to the electrical division of the utilities, but we are talking about the holistic one for both electric and gas. Having that, we want to stress on, this is a table that shows staggered versus synchronized schedule advantages and disadvantages. So I want to stress on that having staggered schedule, the 2 advantages that make a lot of difference here is that we will dedicate appropriate resources and attention to each utility assessment. And also it will enable us to make incremental changes over time, rather than waiting for 4-year cycle for the assessment to happen. So that will be much better, streamlined, incremental. So in our view, that's very helpful. Next, and it's related to the same guiding principle, it's commitment to continuous safety improvement. And we are asking for similar process, or we're asking for a process to what happened after a third-party culture assessment report is ready. We might seem like we're overcomplicating things, but we see this as a very crucial step towards commitment to continuous safety improvement. We don't want to have a safety assessment report while the utilities move forward with using only portion of it and continue to discard some findings in this report. In some cases, we saw utilities claim they don't know what the report was referring to after they submit an improvement plan. So here is our proposed steps. First, the draft report is issued. Utility have a chance to respond to this report, and then a final report is issued. And then within 10 business days, and we mean to put some numbers here as example, because we want to show that we want to move quickly with the process. We don't, the intent of this process is not to delay things, but to move forward quickly. So the utility should submit a sworn statement that they will implement all the findings, and then a resolution will be issued, and then the utility will issue a plan in an advice letter, for example, with all the findings, to act on all the findings. And sorry, so just in case if things didn't go well, and there is still finding that the utility opposed in the report, SPD should request the commission to open an OII to investigate this. That should be the case if they're still opposing for a third-party report. And here is what this is not a new process. We're not asking for a new thing. This is what we are doing in the wildfire safety culture assessment. And it mentioned, excuse me, directly that after having agreed on to implement findings of the most recent safety culture assessment. So these codes are only provided as example. It's not related to this proceeding, but this applies only to the electric division of the utility. But we're giving it just as an example to follow the same process. And I hope I make this quick and open for any questions. Thank you. Emma, I think you're muted. I can't hear your voice.
Oh, thank you. I was muted. So I think maybe in the interest of time, the Safety Policy Division will do our presentation rather quickly, and then we can move on to questions for both of our presentations combined, if that is okay with everyone. Okay, thank you so much. And I will start to share my screen again to get us started. Okay, so both me and my colleague Carolina Contreras will be presenting for this presentation. And what we wanted to do in our presentation was basically to show that we've reflected on the feedback that we've received to date from the 2 concept papers from the summer. And we've started to strategize how we want to use this feedback to inform our safety culture framework that's used for guiding the assessments. It seems that sort of to frame our discussion today, something that both the Joint Utility presentation and the Public Advocate's Office presentation have highlighted is this guiding principle that we also hope to focus on. And it's on our job as a group to reflect commitment to continuous safety improvement and learning based on experience and research that we gain while conducting the assessments and really what this means to us is that we want this guiding principle to apply both to the work that the regulated utilities do, but also to our own, so the CPUC's own proposed safety culture assessment framework and model. And when we say that, we mean that what the CPUC does, we recognize will evolve over time based on what we learn from the assessments. And so we might want to think about framing the first round of assessments as like a pilot program where we are reflecting on and modifying our approach based on what works, what doesn't work, and potential blind spots that we find throughout the process. So as we've sort of talked about throughout today so far, we just wanted to highlight some of the challenges that we have noticed throughout the summer and also through the feedback that we received to date. So there's sort of a goal that we want to get started with conducting assessments given their importance and potential use for detecting safety culture blind spots, but we also want to make sure that before we start, we have consensus on what the goals and guiding principles are. We know that utilities prefer the IMPO safety culture framework, but we want to also make sure that we have a way to link the comprehensive assessments to measurable indicators of safety culture so that we can track improvement over time. Thirdly, we know we want to make sure that we are aligning with energy safety culture requirements for the electric utilities, but we don't know exactly like what we're integrating yet at this stage. And then fourth, there's been some consensus from parties and from the Safety Policy Division that it would be helpful to have a third-party facilitator, but groups have said that this third-party facilitator should be used for different things, so there's not exactly consensus on that yet. So to start us off, we wanted to really focus on just the framework and process that we can put in place as the first thing, so that which would then help us address the other challenges that were on the previous slide. So the SPD staff proposed framework at this stage is to think about using IMPO's 10 traits as our overarching framework for the assessment process because it's broad enough to encompass all fundamental elements of safety culture and aligns with work that's being done at the utilities, as we heard in the feedback received. And it provides a structure for conducting the comprehensive assessments. But then in order to guide and monitor improvement in safety culture over time, we propose still conducting annual evaluations that would use some of the work that has been done through the development of the PURE model to guide this improvement process. So we know that the PURE model is targeted and useful in the improvement process because it focuses on the functional aspects of practices and systems for safety culture in order to guide improvement. Each of these two elements of the safety culture assessment process, so first the comprehensive assessments and then the annual evaluations, really have different purposes. One is to comprehensively assess safety culture and the other is to guide its improvement. Therefore, they require different methodologies or approaches, both of which are important. And then just as a quick background, we wanted to provide just a high-level comparison of the IMPO 10 traits to the 10 functional domains of the PURE model. So you can see those are the 10 characteristics that each of those two frameworks suggest tracking. And then finally, we wanted to show this, that the frameworks both have, so they have the 10 traits and 10 functional domains as the first level. IMPO then has attributes within each trait. And PURE second level is focus areas within each domain. So they're aligned in that sense that they have a second tier. PURE has a third tier, which is indicators that would be used to track safety culture progress within each of the focus areas. So what we are proposing is really looking at so if we're using the 10 traits from IMPO, really looking at how the pure second and third tiers could be nestled under each of those 10 traits from the IMPO framework in order to help guide the improvement process. So we as staff have started to look at how we can nestle those functional elements underneath the really broad and comprehensive framework that IMPO provides, and think about how which components we choose to track. Think about which components we choose to track, and then figure out the appropriate assessment methodologies for conducting both the comprehensive assessments and the annual evaluation, sorry. And next, I'm going to pass it over to Carolina for this next slide.
Thanks, Emma. And so, as Emma mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the concept for the proposed model here that we're presenting it's anchored in the objective of continuous improvement. And I think that's kind of been a common thread in all the presentations that we heard today from the joint utilities and from CalPA. So there's that unifying theme. We want to anchor that in continuous improvement and, you know, learning from what the utilities may have currently as well. So both a model itself could be an iterative process. In previous workshop, we discussed the objective for the assessments as bringing awareness to cultural blind spots that could be precursors to catastrophic safety events so that they may be addressed and improved upon proactively. Again, this suggests two efforts. One is the actual assessment of the culture itself. The assessment should provide information about relevant strengths and weaknesses. And then the second effort is translating what is learned from the assessment into actions for improvement and continuous monitoring for early warning signs that safety culture may be deteriorating in between assessments. So, you know, this improvement piece that we see on the right, on the green, is both an improvement tool and a way to monitor culture signals in between the comprehensive assessments. The framework was designed to recognize that assessing, improving, and monitoring for safety culture are all necessary. So we can't really have one without the other. They really wouldn't have a lot of purpose, and that they are interconnected pieces. So because they have different intents, they will require different tools and different approaches to implement, which is kind of what allows taking a potential IMPO trait, an attribute for a comprehensive assessment, and using the pure model tiers 2 and 3 focus areas for monitoring and just providing an improvement tool. In our framework, the assessment piece looks deeper into culture, while the monitoring and improvement focuses more on the tangible areas and the tangible target areas that support the improvement and the growth of safety culture. So here in the slide, it represents what the model's assessment and improvement monitoring structure would look like. On the left in blue are the assessment components. The assessment would provide comprehensive and in-depth understanding of the prevailing cultural influences at the utility, which affect people's behavior. So essentially a description of the attitudes, beliefs, and values at the utility in relation to the IMPO traits and attributes, or an equally comprehensive normative framework, if that were to be the case, but we are discussing the IMPO framework right now. And the assessment would provide essentially a picture of all these intangible cultural forces. Then on the right in green, you see the monitoring improvement components of the model. Generally speaking, this requires translating the intangible aspects of culture into tangible actions and goals for improvement and monitoring in between assessments. So to be tangible, the improvement piece in the model would target certain focus areas or certain practices known to best support and enhance safety culture to provide that tool for improvement. Specifically, it would look at like the interaction between of people at the utility, the members of the organization, with the targeted safety practices of the focus areas. This would reflect aspects essentially of operationalizing the traits and attributes of the model. So it would consist of the relevant focus areas and a set of indicators for that area. Two very important things to note about the improvement piece is that the areas are targeted on what is found to be most impactful practices. So these should not be considered as a comprehensive manifestation of indicators of the traits or comprehensive look into all of the traits. The indicators do not measure safety directly, but are rather used to monitor signals of cultural improvement or degradation in between assessments. Also, the improvement components can be tied to more than one trait and attribute. This is because the traits and attributes are in and of themselves interconnected. So while this graphic may look like the focus areas fall neatly into each of the attributes and traits, the reality is that they are connected to be more than one of these attributes and traits. You can go to the next slide, Emma. Thanks. So here's just a representative example of what that could look like. We have the input decision-making trait on the left, and one of its attributes, which is conservative bias. And, that's the assessment component. Then tied to that, on the improvement and monitoring piece, one of the relevant functional or practical focus areas for the attribute would be the utilities practices around planning for safety. That would also have a set of, lagging indicators, current indicators, and leading indicators for monitoring and improvement. We can go to the next slide, please, Emma. So here we have sort of a conceptual representation of what the framework activity cycle could look like for both improvement and monitoring and the actual assessment. Again, assessment in blue to the left and improvement in green to the right. A side note here, and I've heard this a little bit from presenters earlier, is that SPD has been relying heavily on subject matter experts, research literature, and other regulatory experiences and studies on safety culture to inform the content of the activity cycle that we're presenting here. One such study, if it's of interest, is the National Academies of Science on strengthening the safety culture of the oil and gas industry. There's a series of recommendations there that I made to the industry, regulators, which are very useful as well. So a comprehensive assessment in blue would take place every 4 or 5 years by an independent third party. It would consist of a multi-method approach to assessing safety culture, including qualitative and quantitative components, and be based on the 10 input traits or whatever similarly comprehensive normative framework is adequate. It would also study the improvement focus areas that were self-evaluated by the IOU annually, and I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily, in the previous 4 to 5 years of this leading up to that assessment. That the intent of that is for it to continually ensure that this focus areas are the best focus areas and that they're representative of what is the traits and attributes, both for the specific utility in question and possibly for the industry as a whole. The output is a description of the values, beliefs, and norms with respect to safety. And, it has recommendations on focus areas for the annual self-improvement, either utility specific, as I mentioned, or for the industry as a whole. This would be used to evaluate the improvement focus areas and evaluating also the model and the process in general. Now, to the right, you have the self-improvement evaluation that would take place annually. And so the output from this comprehensive safety culture assessment would be used to improve the process and the content of the self-improvement evaluations that then would take place for the next 4 or 5 years in between assessments. These would take, the self-improvement evaluations in green would take place annually and would use the focus areas, excuse me, that are tied to the traits and the attributes of the comprehensive assessment. It would have a more prominent quantitative component, and or at least be building up towards a more quantitative component. It includes a self-evaluation by utilities leadership based on the focus areas. It can also have an option for verifying that self-evaluation. The output would be monitored annually, and it would incorporate the input from the comprehensive assessment. One thing to note here is that you may see that there is a role that a third-party facilitator can have on evaluating and improving the process and the model. So for example, evaluating the assessment results across the industries to recommend changes or improvements for the focus areas, for the model itself, for the process, so that, you know, it is founded on the continuous improvement principle that is adopted, would be considered in this proceeding. Then this third party could also more generally just facilitate efforts for engagement and promoting safety culture for the industry as a whole during the self-improvement process or during the assessment process or throughout, both. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you, Carolina. Here we just have some suggested next steps for our process, which would be to continue to integrate or map the intro attributes and the pure focus areas to figure out what should be tracked in the annual evaluations, and to compare those to energy safety's annual requirements to make sure that we're in alignment and not duplicating requirements, to think about what requirements there should be for gas utilities who are not implicated in the energy safety requirements, to develop a pilot program for the overall assessment process that includes both of the elements that Carolina was talking about, and then lastly, to think about the role of a third-party evaluator or facilitator in assisting with this work. And so next I'm going to move on to a facilitated question and answer session that we can start with questions that are related to the Public Advocate's Office presentation or the Safety Policy Division's presentation. And I wanted to pause first for commissioner questions, and then we can go to audience questions. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand, or you can also type your questions into the chat, and I will pass it over to Commissioner Houck first.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you for this presentation. I know this is a complex area, and we're kind of treading on new ground in some ways here. I guess my first question was looking at how you've combined INPO and the pure models, and whether you see are they going to be easily integrated? I know you've got the INPO inputs on the assessment side, and then you're using the pure model components for the other two tiers. Can you talk a little bit about whether you see any concerns or issues in being able to integrate how those two models are going to be able to work together?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So our staff has actually started to do this like mapping process, and we did our first take at it with a very large Excel spreadsheet that has like the 10 info traits and then all of the pure attributes. What we found from that process is that we were able to map all of the pure focus area, so all of the like second level of the pure model, into at least one info trait. So we found that basically everything could fit under a trait, But we also found that process to be very subjective as expected. Something that we started to do is we're thinking about experts that we can reach out to help us sort of validate that process that we undertook. And then also thinking about how we can get feedback on our subjective take on where different pure focus areas should go under each trait. But yeah, so we did find that overall there's alignment. We're just going to need additional expert input on whether what we thought about where different focus areas should go makes sense. So we did ask Dr. Schulman, but we're looking to ask additional experts and also to get the utility feedback on that when we sort of like take it to the next step.
Okay, no, thank you. I think that makes sense to get the expert and the utility input on where you come out. My second question goes to the independent organization that could be conducting the assessments. Have you thought about, are you leaning towards looking at an independent organization, and if they're independent, would they be contracted with the CPUC? Would they be the same organization working with energy safety? Or I guess, how are you defining independent in regards to their role with the utilities and with the two regulatory agencies?
Thank you. Carolina or Rick, do you want to tackle that question, or would you like me to?
I can add just a little bit. I think that there's possibly two different aspects that can be looked at here. And from what I see, your question, Commissioner Houck, is more about the actual assessment itself. So and that I would see it potentially as like a different activity to monitoring and engaging and facilitating discussions. So I guess the question would be, those are both third parties, but then the independent aspect, I think, is one that we haven't internally discussed, what independent actually means. But in terms of third party, there's different roles that a third party can have. So in terms of independent, I don't think that we've actually have discussed that at length internally.
And would you be envisioning that that this third party would be also working with energy safety or with the CPUC as far as how you're going to be coordinating the 5-year versus the 1-year assessments?
Yeah,
or is that something that's, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think your questions are very good, Commissioner. We would, I think, ideally have this third party be coordinating between all the parties that are involved, including energy safety, CPUC, and the IOUs. And so they really act as a true independent body in a sense. And of course, they would still have some requirements that would be, I think, identified by the CPUC of things that they should do. And but they would also be being able to have all the parties really play a role in determining how that third party functions. So we haven't completely figured out what that structure is. We're actually asking for input from people and parties to have suggestions of how that kind of body might function. But I think the idea is that there is this independent body that allows for free flow of information, facilitates the collaboration and the learning that the IOUs talked about in a way where there's a fair amount of trust and not so much of the regulatory oversight and regulatory kind of enforcement action associated with that particular body. But at the same time, it does need to have some authority that gives it, not just as a guiding board that has opinions but has some way in its mandate. I'm not
I
sure
would
if that
just
helps.
add that it's that this third party is not necessarily the same party that conducts the assessment. That's just the distinction I think that would be important to make. It doesn't necessarily mean that the third party would be the one to conduct the assessment. And I think that's the third party that it's just a distinction that I think is important to make.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that and look forward to further discussions.
So I wanted to pause to see if Commissioner Rechtschaffen, Commissioner Shiroma, or Commissioner Reynolds, you had any questions?
I had a general question. It may have been answered by Carolyn's slides and the integration of the INPO and the pure schemes, but the question is, it goes to the applicability of the safety culture system in the nuclear setting to entities that are not as pervasively regulated as the non-nuclear parts of our utilities are. And I do know, and we've had prior safety culture hearings where we've heard about how successful the safety culture has been in the nuclear industry as well as the aviation industry. But we've also heard that they're extremely tightly regulated. All aspects are very closely regulated and monitored. And that's not the case except for on the PG&E side and outside of Diablo Canyon. And I know there was mention to Edison's familiarity with songs here. So I'm just wondering how we think about that safety culture is built upon a bedrock of very pervasive regulation. Now, as I say, this may be better. I don't know if this is better addressed to the staff or to the utilities, but as I read what you do, you're trying to combine elements of both systems that work well together. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that question, the larger question.
Yeah, maybe I can start us off, and then Carolyn, I can pass to you based on your understanding of the SoCalGas assessment. But when we talk about using the INPO framework, what we really mean is using those 10 traits as like the guidance for the safety culture assessments. And that is the same 10 trait framework that was used for the SoCalGas the SoCalGas Safety Culture OII. So we do have some precedent of those traits being broadly applicable to this industry as well. But Carolyn, I don't know if you have anything that you would want to add.
So I think it's a very good question, Commissioner Rechtschaffen, and something I think that we are very aware of as we have spoken with a lot of the other regulators as well, in that, you know, the INPO does have is an industry-led organization. The industry regulated by USNRC, and we've actually reached out to the USNRC and have had a good long session discussing their process in relation to the INPO traits. And they, for example, they have staff who is embedded at the utilities, and they can observe any actual portion of improvement and monitoring of safety culture and as they wish. So it is inherently sort of a very different hands-on regulation or just oversight of culture that they have in the nuclear industry. So we've learned about that. And in looking at the INPO framework, I think, like Emma mentioned, it's important to keep two items distinct, which is easily to just combine them when we talk about using that framework. One is the traits and the attributes. So that's the description of what the normative framework of what the culture should be. The other component is what's the process used to apply it? What are the methods used to assess it? What happens afterwards? How does it get improved? And so far, what at least staff is proposing here is that we just take a look at these 10 attributes and 10 traits and attributes in a comprehensive assessment, but that we inject the need for the industries that we regulate into account for the mechanisms to implement those assessment, use that information, and conduct the monitoring and improvement activities differently than, necessarily like the UNSNRC may do. But I think that is absolutely a gap between just the straight application in the nuclear industry and what we do here, as we don't have that level of scrutiny and insight that the U.S. nuclear regulator does.
Right. I know. I recently visited Diablo Canyon, and I learned that there were, as you said, there are 2 NRC employees who are there full time. I don't know if it's 1 or 2, but that's a constant feature there. But thank you for those responses.
And if I may, I think this is where the improvement and monitoring piece, we're trying to get that a little bit more transparency through that piece, through the improvement and monitoring component of the model.
Thank you, Carolina. I wanted to pause to see if Commissioner Reynolds or Commissioner Sharoma had any questions. Oh, I see Commissioner Sharoma, you have your hand raised, I think.
Yes, thank you. This has been very informative. And the slide deck is really very laser-like in guiding us today. My question is, in the INPA and the PURE, these 2 rubrics, and at this point you're proposing to look at what best things can be taken from both going forward and so forth. Indeed, in the wildfire mitigation, safety culture workshops and what have you, briefings, we have heard from governing board members and members of the safety committees of the board of directors or governing board. So in this effort and putting together a framework, does that include monitoring by those safety committees, the keen involvement of the board of directors? A to Z within the framework of each of the utilities? Or have you gotten that? Or have you gotten that granular or that far?
And so, Commissioner Sharma, maybe I'll take a stab a little bit at that. I think that to some extent, the improvement piece is targeted at leadership. So I think the question's adequate. So what are you monitoring and looking at having that transparency between assessments about the utility? So it is focused on leadership. I guess it would be a matter of who are the members of leadership that would probably need to take part in this evaluation, and what are the types of practices and indicators related to that leadership that would indicate that would best support safety culture improvement in the long run. So there is some content, but there is, of course, the discussions being had about what that could look like. So I think that it may be premature to say one way or the other at this point, based on where we're at.
Many things under consideration, essentially.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, if I could ask a brief question. This may be I'd be interested in hearing from SPD or CalPA or the utilities, whoever might have a viewpoint on this. Are there other electric or gas utilities elsewhere in the United States or elsewhere in the world that we can look to as really a gold standard for safety culture implementation, or even who we could look to for some great practices in a particular area or particular aspect of safety culture implementation? Or are we inventing the wheel here and now? Open floor to any participant who might have a perspective on this topic.
If nobody at SPD has some input, I would share what we've done and what we've learned from other regulators. CPUC does participate in the North American Regulators Working Group on Safety Culture, which is led by the Canadian oil and gas regulator, energy regulator. And through that process, we've learned a lot about what other, regulators are doing. The ultimate difference, what we've found from what other regulators are doing and what we are required to do, is that we have a legislative requirement to assess safety culture, whereas we've not really encountered other regulators who are mandated to develop something around a requirement for safety culture. However, there's different approaches, and what we've learned primarily is that the US is very different in its approach to safety culture than it is in other countries. US has a more hands-on in the nuclear industry, and perhaps more so on the more prescriptive, could be said, than some of the approaches in other countries. And there's a host of reasons why it's speculated that that's the case. You know, sometimes it can be litigation. We have a very different legal system in the US. But the closest in our industry that we have is the Canadian Energy Regulator. The Canadian Energy Regulator regulates pipeline operators, and those are the same pipeline operators that that the CPUC regulates, and they've got a safety culture framework, safety policy, and they have a guidance for assessment that they've issued, but they're not responding to legislative requirements, which is a big difference. Abroad, there's a host of industries, but we've because of the IMPO, we've looked to the US nuclear regulator a little bit more to see how they are doing their regulation. But there's obviously big gaps of the maturity level that they're at, and other industries to the maturity level of safety culture that we are at.
That's helpful, and I'm particularly curious about electric and gas utilities, partly because of the nature of the infrastructure, the widespread geographic distribution of the utility systems here, and I'm interested in whether there are some analogs within this space specifically that we can look to. But the perspectives on some of the international regulators and the nuclear industry are very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, to address your specific question, Commissioner Reynolds, I've had conversations with a lot of gas utilities across the country, both individually and through our relationship with the American Gas Association. And while a lot of utility companies are implementing aspects of safety culture improvements into their safety management systems approach, I'm not aware of any other gas utility that's kind of got this regulatory driven safety culture effort in place that looks to try and turn what is generally considered to be a fairly subjective area into something very empirical. I'm just not aware of other examples of that.
Thank you, Cedric, for adding to that. I wanted to pass it over to Will Abrams, because I think you've had your hand raised for a while now. So if you wanted to come off mute and ask your question, you could do that.
Great. Thanks very much. Really appreciate the workshop, and a lot of great work obviously went into this. Love the concepts of sort of integrating the PURE and the IMPO frameworks and working from the traits and attributes. Just had some questions regarding sort of how this integrates with other aspects of the commission's work and evaluations and general sort of communications. And, you know, on the communication fronts, I just wanted to understand, you know, with an assessment, you know, thinking through how that's going to be communicated to the public. I'm sort of thinking around the lines of sort of looking at sort of the restaurant industry and how, you know, it's communicated to the public with, you know, a letter grade of sort of A through F, and then things that stem from that depending on that grade, and whatever framework we put together, what might be the communications that help inform the public about how utilities are doing. And from that, really wanted to try to understand how this self-assessment piece is going to be moderated, and the degree to which we're thinking about how much self-assessment is going to be permitted under sort of what conditions. So I'm sort of thinking through, you know, if a particular utility has a lot of violations, or potentially there are, you know, criminal convictions or other things there, are we still feeling like that should lead to more self-assessment, or does that self-assessment get curtailed because of those violations? And then, you know, on the integration piece, just wanted to understand how this could be integrated with WMP measures and things like that, so that we're not having a culture of safety separate and apart from the actual implementation of safety, and making sure that there are linkages there. So didn't know if folks had thoughts about those aspects, but thank you.
Thank you for those great questions. For the first question of how this all will be communicated to the public, something that we've talked about using is the annual safety briefings that already occur. So having utilities report on progress from either their most recent safety culture comprehensive assessment or their annual self-evaluation during those annual briefings that already happen with the commissioners. And then for the question of whether certain utilities that might be under additional scrutiny, whether or not we will continue to rely on the self-assessment for those utilities, I think that really the goal of the comprehensive assessments is to help like validate, because those would be undertaken by an independent third party, that they would help us sort of like independently evaluate whether or not what utilities are finding in their self-evaluation is also aligned with what this like independent evaluator would identify. So they would be like the check on whether the self-evaluations are missing any sort of blind spots that the utilities are not finding. And then I think that you bring up a really good point about our work with energy safety and our need to align. I think when we start to have a better understanding of what we're asking in our annual evaluations, we'll be able to work more closely with energy safety to align with their work, including wildfire mitigation plans. But I wanted to see if anyone else from my team wanted to respond to any of those questions or add to them.
I think maybe the only part I would add is that I think we've intentionally tried to focus on what we are getting out of this and how we want to take a look at it from a cultural perspective, so that we can all figure out what are the oversight mechanisms and tools that make sense given the objectives that we want to achieve. once we've identified those objectives, it may be easier to then look at the mechanisms to oversee and to add that additional transparency for the public, so that what the public is receiving is a product that they can rely on. So because it's sort of iterative right now, we wanted to sort of focus a little bit on what are these cultural pieces, what do they look like, and have that in better shape to discuss what that could mean for the public and what that could mean in terms of the oversight and the tying in with other regulatory processes.
Thank you, Carolina. Next, I wanted to pass it over to Dr. Cooper, so you can come off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, panel and commissioners. I've got one observation and one question, and the observation and both questions relate to the IMPO pure integration. In terms of the topics of IMPO, which is the IMPO survey, they're almost identical to the pure topics. There's almost 100% correspondence, except that the pure topics also include the strategy from the board and the senior management teams of the IOUs as well in relation to the path forward for safety culture. The question relates to the fact that IMPO is a survey, and the previous assessment of Southern California Gas also used a survey, but didn't report any quantification or numbers. So my question to the team, to Carolina in particular, is this proposed assessment, is it going to be qualitative or is it going to be quantitative? If it's qualitative, then how do the IOUs know where they are now in relation to where they're trying to get to, and how do they know they've got there? And that's, really the issue. So the trays are actually identical, apart from the fact that Pure adds strategy. But what's the approach? Is this qualitative or quantitative?
So I'll first address the first question of the IMPO survey. And again, I want to make it clear to everybody that what we're proposing here is we're not proposing to use the processes and methods to assess culture that IMPO has. IMPO is an industry-led organization that provides its members with useful guidance for assessing culture. However, what we are proposing is that the cultural traits, their description, and their attributes be used as the basis for a comprehensive assessment. So we're not proposing that IMPO processes, methods for assessing be used. And that's kind of one thing that I want to make very distinct. So when we're talking about a survey, we're not proposing that we use the IMPO survey, but that a survey could be used. But multiple assessment methods is what we are proposing. Multiple assessment methods being possibly survey, site observations, document review, interviews, focus groups, for example. So that's more in the process and method area, which we're not specifying yet which ones there could be, but a multi-method could have all of those. Then on the integration piece of them both, and the qualitative and quantitative, we are going by one of the recommendations from the National Academies on strengthening the safety culture of oil and gas industry post-Macondo. These are recommendations to both the Bureau, to BSEE and to the industry, is that the assessments contain both a quantitative and a qualitative component. So what we are proposing is that the comprehensive assessment have both a qualitative and a quantitative component. Inherently, if the annual assessments are going to have a primary quantitative component, that's going to require the comprehensive assessor to have a quantitative component. Now, the SoCalGas OII survey did have a quantitative component in terms of the survey itself. What quantitative means in terms, does it have an ultimate number that says this is the level of safety culture of this utility? I don't think that's yet where we're going necessarily, still to be determined. But what we do know is that we are proposing that it have the quantitative and the qualitative component for the comprehensive. The comprehensive assessment will have to take a look at and validate what the focus areas of the annual improvement self-evaluations are, which are primarily quantitative. So yes, they will have to have both. That's kind of what we're proposing here.
Thank you, Carolina. We have one more hand raised. So Ariel, I wanted to pass it over to you to ask your question.
Thank you, Emma. I do appreciate that. Thank you for putting on this great workshop, and it's good. That's really appreciate seeing the 3 commissioners here today. It definitely sends a message as a high priority. First, SBA appreciates Commissioner Rechtschaffen asking whether the strength of the cultural process is tied to degree of limited enforcement. It's a question and comment that SBA has asked previously, and we heard today from the IRUs an answer is somewhat less strident than, for instance, PG&E's comments in August. And so I'm interested in hearing from Dr. Schulman, Dr. Cooper, other experts on the tension between the enforcement piece and the communication piece, because there is some concern that the IOUs may be pushing an agenda here to weaken appropriate enforcement. And then quickly, a second question is that we also heard, as SBA commented earlier today, about an increased level of, so I commented previously, we heard today about increased level of on-the-ground involvement by the commission. And I noted, heard this, I think, from Commissioner Rechtschaffen and Ms. Contreras, but I didn't see any notation of this, these comments in the background list. So I'm curious to hear where this additional expansion of on-the-ground involvement by the commission fits in with the framework discussed today. Thank you.
So Emma, I can just provide some information. I don't think our slides reflected your observation about the on-the-ground involvement, and it's a good point, and thank you for pointing it out. But it's not to say that it can't happen as part of sort of increasing, if using a framework that is more applicable in an industry that has more presence by the regulator on the ground, then there is potential room for considering staff's presence as well on the ground, which I think is what you're referring to, Mr. Strauss. So it wasn't explicit in this in the slides, and it's not because we didn't want it added. I think it may have been just we were focusing sort of on the framework of the model itself, on the assessment piece, but there is potential that that's an activity that could provide more insight and more transparency to the monitoring of culture through in between assessments.
Thank you, Carolina. Now we're going to move on, in the interest of time, to Commissioner closing remarks. So I can pass it over to Commissioner Houck if you have closing remarks first.
Just wanted to thank everyone today, the utility presenters, our staff that presented today, and all of the work that's gone into making this workshop possible. This is a very important discussion. I know safety and how we are moving forward in the safety culture assessments is a priority and something very important to the commission and commissioners. So just wanted to thank everyone and wanted to thank our experts for being here today to listen and for the work that they've provided as well. And look forward to further discussions as we develop the proposal that will be anticipated to be issued before the end of this year. Emma, we can't hear you. Oh,
Oh, I'm on mute again.
great. Okay.
Sorry. Thank you. Commissioner Rechtschaffen, if you have any closing remarks you wanted to make.
I want to echo my thanks to you and Carolina and the others who participated. I think this is really difficult, but obviously extremely important work, difficult work. Commissioner Reynolds asked a pertinent question about what other examples do we have. We've been searching for those for a while. That's why we're looking to other industries. I am impressed by the continued evolution and growth and the sophistication of what we're doing here, both on our part and on the utilities part. And I think we need to continue to give it the high level of attention and priority that it has as we go forward. Thank you. And I have to sign off for a 3 o'clock call, so I very much appreciate everyone's participation today.
Thank you, Commissioner Rechtschaffen. Commissioner Reynolds, if you have any closing remarks you wanted to add.
Just briefly, I'll echo the thanks of my colleagues and appreciate and look forward to further development in this rulemaking.
Thank you. And lastly, Commissioner Shiroma, if you have any closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Emma, and for a very, very well-run workshop discussion. I said at the beginning that I was looking forward to listening and learning, and hopefully I've accomplished both. I think that the stakeholder process, the careful effort to look at the types of criteria that have been used, how that folds into a regulatory scheme, a multi-year effort, drawing upon expertise, and listening to the input from the public and the interested parties, any interveners. I have great confidence that we'll see an excellent proposal. So thank you for today's discussion. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you. So thank you all for attending, and thank you, commissioners, for your closing remarks. And SPD will follow up with participants of the workshop with a recording and with additional materials for the proceeding through the service list. So have a great afternoon, everyone. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.